We started Culturally Speaking to indulge our curiosity about the way others live and a desire to inspire conversations about how we have far more in common than we realise.
How are you today?
It's the most Mondayest of Mondays. I mean, it's the beginning of November. We've just had Guy Fawkes, which was a really fun weekend. I went to fireworks. What about you? How was yours?
I was kept up all night because of the fireworks. So I kind of heard them. I didn't go see them because I think growing up in Hong Kong, like fireworks are meh. Seen them too much. It's got to be something spectacular to make me go see it. Okay, so we're on episode 2 of this season about being Asian. And after talking about growing up, now we're talking about coming of age, which for me actually traversed geographies. So a very interesting experience for me.
You know, when we were talking about this season and planning out what we were going to talk about, this one for me, I was really unsure whether I should talk about it as like my experience here in the UK or whether it's supposed to be like how people grow up in India. And I guess I'll talk about a bit of both. I'll preface it by saying I've never lived in India and I didn't grow up there. But yes, I think it's almost like I felt like I grew up in two places despite only living in one, if that makes any sense.
And my disclaimer is that I left Hong Kong around 15, 16. So my experience of coming of age in Hong Kong kind of stops abruptly at that age and then thrown into the depths of a different culture at a very, I guess, formative age range. So one thing that everybody, I think, experiences a change in is where you live. So for me, it's a much simpler open and shut case, right? I came to boarding school, so therefore my place of living changed. Hong Kong is a very traditional city, even though it is very global. So I think when we think of Hong Kong, we think of it as very multicultural, all of that. But don't forget, more than 90% of the residents are still Hong Kong Chinese. I think this was interesting for me, especially because I then moved countries to a much more open and Western culture. There was some pressure, I think, to uphold these traditional values, almost Confucius values and expectations. But then I was, shown a much more open, very different culture during those years. These things I find, even for my friends who never left the city, as you grow older, you get exposed to more cultures, more different types of standards, right, on all aspects. You start getting some kind of conflict, right? What you've been told growing up, what you think you should adhere to, and then what your heart wants to do.
And I would say all of that is so applicable, even if, like you, somebody hasn't moved countries. If you've grown up between two cultures, or even between a culture that's evolved hugely, even within like a couple of generations, what you've said, I think, will resonate so much. As you know, obviously, I always have lived in the UK. And my experience is probably very similar to many people that are second, third gen. But I guess my difference was I grew up in one place in the UK and then I moved to London. And it's amazing how city or urban mentality versus maybe a more rural community changes, even within my own culture. I think in terms of things you're exposed to, that is very much, in my case, largely down to where I was living, either outside of London, inside of London. I do think there are different perceptions. And And I think that's true of every age as well. It's not just growing up, as a child into a young adult, into, your adulthood. It's also as you go through the different stages of life. I think there are marked differences. In terms of traditional outlooks, so I would say being a British Indian is a broad church. Like, it's a very wide range. There is, I don't think, one voice that speaks for everybody. And I guess I can only tell you what I know. I've always been told my family is quite progressive, quite forward-thinking, quite modern in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to kind of survey traditional Indian values around growing up and the home, I think you'd find they are more traditional than average British values.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to put it into a spectrum of British values versus British Indian values, or even Indian values, I think they are more traditional. And a lot of it, I actually think, is driven by, like I said, one, your own family, but two, your own economic position in life.
Yeah.
Your own socioeconomic position, because something as simple as the kind of house you live in, or the flat you live in, or the area you live in is going to determine, and we'll touch on it in a minute, but multi-generational homes, how much land you have, whether you've got separate annexes, is it granny flats, is it people sharing rooms, things like that. A lot of that is just frankly driven by socioeconomics rather than sometimes values of what people can afford and what they desire.
Agree. I think, let's talk about house prices.
Exactly.
Hong Kong is not any better than London, right, in that respect. And I was doing some research on the statistics. So in 2022, 53% of residents in Hong Kong lived in private permanent housing. The rest are in public permanent housing. So I guess, I've been quite privileged growing up, so I never ventured into process of getting public housing, but to my knowledge, it's not I think it's the same here, right? It's not as if you just send in an application and you get given a flat. It can be a very long process, and there are two types. Ones which are given to you by the council. The other is, similar to the shared ownership structure in this country, where you pay a cheaper rent, I guess, until you can afford to buy it out, etc. Now, in Chinese culture, though, it's almost sought after to have at least 3 generations still living together. There's actually a term called 五代同堂. It actually means 5 generations living together. Now, it's interesting you talked about the socioeconomic status versus what you want, perhaps because of values. Even in these public housing flats, which are pretty crowded, pretty small. And I think people would have seen these in documentaries talking about housing in Hong Kong. They're these kind of monstrous, massive buildings. Maybe, a few thousand, maybe even tens of thousands of people would live in the same panel of flats, right? You'd still have your grandparent and your parents and you living there when you're an adult. So I think most people live at home until at least university, where you move out to university accommodation. So definitely my experience is an anomaly, right? Because I went to a boarding school, which obviously meant I moved away from living with my parents, moved away from my hometown. Personally, I've heard of these stories, and it's quite often depicted in films as well. It can get a little bit awkward, especially as you get into, puberty, and you require more privacy. And sometimes at whatever age, you might just be more sensitive, right, to other people being in your space. And obviously, it means when you go out, people know when you get home, right? So I think this is quite often a trigger point almost for people to want to get married. Because that's when they can actually, with 2 people's income, they can afford to move out and actually have privacy. So unless you've experienced flat sharing during uni, that could well be someone's first experience of living with someone that's not family.
And that's pretty kind of, in certain people's minds, that'll be very shocking. Because as you're saying all of that, I'm very distinctly aware of, well, the norm in the UK is, well, you probably live at home until you go to university, unless, of course, your boarding is, as you say. But let's say the majority of, you live at home, you go to university, and that's for the first time you move out. You live in sometimes flat share, sometimes university accommodation. And that's pretty rife. And then most people continue that pattern until either, as you say, they choose to live alone if they can or want to, they choose to live with a partner if they want to or can, or they go down the road of home ownership. So it's interesting that you said like that the first time you live with somebody that's not your family will be your partner by the time you get married in Hong Kong. And to be honest, I think there are people that will have exactly that same experience, whether they're British Indian or an Indian living in India. I think the big differences, and you touched on it, is geography. I think we need to just highlight to people how the population density in terms of land mass of Hong Kong is exceptionally high. And that's why I made the point of, I wasn't raised in London, and where I did grow up, land is not particularly an issue. Having multi-generational households doesn't cause necessarily the space conflict that you're talking about, where people will actually have their own space to socialize, their own place to sleep, bathe. You wouldn't and you might have some communal living areas if you choose to engage in them, but you might have a granny annex where your grandparents have their own sitting room, maybe their own entrance, etc. So you might have actually very segregated living, but one building, if you like, to put it that way.
Interesting you say this, because I feel like that is an aspect that is lacking in Chinese culture, which is even the concept of personal space. It's just not really a thing, I feel. I don't know if, of course, I'm only limited to my own experiences, but I say this in the most neutral tone possible. I just don't think this is what people consider or even factor in. So usually if you are sharing your home with, 2 generations above, granny or granddad will get first dibs on having their own room, right? Because of the hierarchy in a family. And obviously parents will have their own room. So basically all the other siblings will be in one room. And I'm really close with my brother, so I think we would have been fine.
There's close, I can imagine, and there's being an adolescent and a teen and girl boy, and I think there is a time for your own space. As think close as you can be.
Well, we'll touch on sexual maturity right after this, but I think there's a reason why that's not factored in.
Yes. And the complete flip side of everything I've just said about granny annexes and separate floors and bedrooms and this, that, and the other in the UK is that I remember the very first time I went to India, and I was 4.5, give or take. And we went to Mumbai, which is actually, very cosmopolitan, very city. It was post the change, as it were, from Bombay to Mumbai. And, I went to with some family. Again, multi-generational household, but, very large old colonial home. So kind of felt quite familiar to what I knew. And then we went out to the countryside, to the villages. And the houses there, so you walk in the front door, and it's just one big, long room. There are no doors. And the beds are all downstairs. And these beds are ginormous. I'm talking like easily 6 of us could fit on that bed. So like parents, children, everybody sleep in this one humongous bed. And they're open, like everybody is in this one communal space. And granted, this was the 90s and things have moved on since. But again, there is absolutely no personal space in that sense. Everybody socializes together, they eat together, and they sleep in one big humongous room together. It's only if, as you say, you're the head of the household, you'd have your own bedroom, perhaps, your own space.
Explain my face.
Je shook. But also, it's not like, they wouldn't think of anything of co-sleeping. I know that's a very controversial term to some people that have children. They absolutely would co-sleep with their children when they're young.
Wait, so how many floors are in this property?
Typically, very traditionally, they're single-story homes, and they just got the property just extends very far and wide with various sections. So you'll go through the house. There'll be communal sitting rooms. There'll be bedrooms. There'll be kitchen, dining areas, and it would go on and on, almost like a compound, if you like. And now you do have multi-story homes, and they would have bedrooms upstairs and bathrooms.
What happens if someone snores?
Oh, they do. Absolutely. Granddad over there snoring away. So yeah.
So they're kind of like Charlie Bucket and his grandparents.
So yeah, I mean that's the other alternative, right, that people have come from. So you tell them to go from that to here, everybody have their own room and bed and potentially bathroom.
Yeah. My mind is so blown. I'm trying to imagine how big this place has to be.
But this is why I'm saying where land is not an issue, right? It's not finite, it's almost infinite.
So things go horizontally rather than vertically.
Very kind of old school traditionally, yes. Where there's the infrastructure is not as built up. Now, yes, people would live in flats, apartments. Towns are much more built up.
What about the toilets?
There's just bathroom. I mean, there's a normal bathroom as we would understand it. I mean, Asian bathroom, think squat situation. But like way back. Now, no. Now they're very much the way we would expect them to be.
So I was thinking, what castle is that? Like where there's like communal bathroom where you just sit next to each other.
Ew, no, that's too boarding school for me.
So that segues nicely, right? I think this whole talk of privacy, all of that, into sexual maturity. I'll give you a quick rundown because my experience is, I think, very simple to explain. In Hong Kong, and I'll caveat this by saying I think your socioeconomic status does play into this. But in the circles I was in, meaning kind of middle class, going to private school, that kind of circle, generally speaking, conservative. So there wasn't really, how in schools here, there's the whole condom and banana sex education thing. It just doesn't happen in Hong Kong.
That's very American high school.
Okay, in America then, but that kind of thing just is not discussed. So I remember in kind of end of year 6 towards beginning of year 7, where you had general sciences, that type of thing, is when we were taught, right, about periods, sexual organs. It was a very academic approach to talking about this. I went to a very religious school, especially, so there really wasn't a lot of conversation, adult education about what is sex. Maybe actually those two girls that are always together, that's called being lesbians. Like there was zero open conversation about this. That's not to say people don't acquire this knowledge themselves elsewhere, but it's just not talked about really, which meant I was in for a shock when I came for boarding school. So I came at 6th form, so kind of 15, 16 years old. Wow. Basically. It was wild. First of all, people wearing makeup to school. It was like, why? What? How? In my school in Hong Kong, I think we covered it in the last episode, right? Things were strict. So if your hair touched your shoulder, you had to put it up in a simple hairstyle. Even the scrunchie had to be the school kind of blue. It was that kind of strict, all the way to people customizing their uniform. So it's like low-waisted, as we know, that was the trend back then. People wearing push-up pink bras under their white shirts. And to me, that was also alien, because the 16-year-old that came from Hong Kong hadn't even thought about sexualizing herself. or making herself look attractive as an adult would. That was just not in my mind. Zero.
Did you feel like you left there a child and the classes you entered, like the girls here were like they were basically adults?
Yeah. And I think you alluded to it, right? That even in your school, once you reach 16 years old, suddenly there are no rules. So that to me was really, really surprising, especially when I heard classmates, spending the weekends at their boyfriends, meaning their parents knew about it. And I was like, what? Like, this would never have been allowed where I came from. And I think generally, they just talked about all of these things very readily, like much more than I expected.
It's interesting you say that. So I think I'll be very explicit. So when you think about like British Indian values, I think I said it, you'd still consider them to be quite traditional. The school I went to was Christian. It was a girls' school like yours. So it was more conservative for sure on the scale of British schools. Probably not the most, but certainly wasn't the norm. And all of our like learning, I think you're right, there was the academic side to it that you had to learn about it in a very like biological way. But I think the difference is in the UK, PSHE is part of the curriculum and it is mandated that you have to teach it. And for anyone who's international doesn't know what that is, it's basically a lesson that you get, I think it's either once a week or once a fortnight, where it's about personal health, sexual relationships. And that has only strengthened in time, I believe, in the curriculum. And it's only become an even bigger part of having to have these conversations in the classroom. Because otherwise, what you get is people, like you say, they acquire knowledge. It's Chinese whispers, right? It's spread. I distinctly remember a time at primary school where this one Chinese whisper about what did this mean and had anyone done it had like spread like wildfire. And looking back, it was so ridiculous because, I mean, these children are like 8.
I mean,
so it's
for all I know, right, it could have been taught in my school while I was away, like in my school in Hong Kong, but I distinctly remember that the age where people first get taught this is much, much younger here.
It is, and that's what I would say, even if it was taught probably when you maybe have left Hong Kong, I still think it happens far, far earlier here. And I do think that's better, in my own personal opinion. I think in an age-appropriate way, there is the right way to introduce children to all of the things that are appropriate at their age. Firstly, from a safety point of view, I think that has become a really big focus in schools of, the safety of children, and then recognizing what's safe, what's normal, what's right, and then also recognizing what's wrong and what's not acceptable. I think that was not taught to us. It was what I learned from knowing what was modeled to me as safe. And I was very fortunate that I had really good models and really good people that behaved very well around me. But that was luck rather than actually being, that being taught to me.
I think it's interesting you said at the right age. So most people growing up anywhere, right, get a lot of their information from the TV, from movies. Now, of course, in Hong Kong, we have like a, normal import of international films. And I remember it used to be whenever we watch like James Bond or something, and when that saxophone music comes on and things are about to go down, that's when like the PG, parental guidance flag comes up, and usually we cover our eyes or something. It was very much
did you have to cover your eyes?
Yeah.
I remember having to do that. Are movies censored in any way?
I think probably more so now. Kids nowadays sleep a lot later than when I was a kid, I think. I used to sleep at like 9, the latest.
I was going to say, what time is Watershed there? Because it's 9. I think it's still 9 p.m. here. Yeah.
9. And the TV shows you get before that, right? It's usually a sitcom. I guess kind of like what's the one we get here?
EastEnders.
Things like that, right? But
soaps.
Yeah, but those have very adult content, right? The kind of storyline is very complicated. The ones in Hong Kong, vanilla AF. Like they can't be lovelier to watch. It's just usually funny, people making like jokes about things, or it's like slapstick humor, it's that kind of thing. It's quite nice to watch actually. But what I find interesting is watching some of the series as an adult now. I'm like, but this is so fake because you are actually openly alluding to the fact that these two adults have been in a long-term relationship and they live together, and yet you pretend they don't, have sex. And I find that so interesting. Like in this sitcom in particular, apart from two of the main characters who are actually married, I've never seen anyone kiss. And when they kiss, it's not like it's not Game of Thrones kissing. It's just, like kids kissing, like peck. and I find that really interesting because when you go out in Hong Kong in society, people know that's not how people kiss. That's not how they kiss.
We've talked about this before on the podcast, though, is what you're seeing in media, is it replicated in the way people are living? Because when you're out and about in Hong Kong, are people engaging in full-on displays of PDA the way they do in London? No, they don't, right? They don't.
No. But I find it's interesting because so much of like a child's mind is influenced by media nowadays, right? And this sets such a strong kind of boundary, I think, in their mind of what's acceptable. And there's a reason, right? Because some of these sitcoms have kind of product placements or government announcements put in, and I get that. And it's the most effective way of getting the message out. But even things like holding hands or like they have a lot of subliminal messaging of like, oh, you're a boy, you're a girl, you're not related, you shouldn't be alone in the same room together. There's a lot of that, and I find that very entertaining actually. I'm often amused when I watch it because the same people will watch Game of Thrones half an hour later.
Yeah, and I think this is also the same. I'd like to point out and I can only speak for like the Indian diaspora, but people of perhaps like my grandparents' generation, they would watch these like telenovelas or these soaps, and they would be the same ones that are shown in India, but then they've people watch them here too, and it's the same thing. Nobody actually engages in any PDA. Like there's no touching of any sort between two people, no matter what kind of relationship, or they used to be, right? And what I like now is though that's changed. So like people would never explicitly kiss on the lips, and that's now changed in movies. Like people do, and it has filtered down into like modern celebrity culture. Like celebrity culture is a big influencer of how people live and how it actually impacts their lives. So people now live together before they're married, and there are public displays of affection on social media. People will kiss on the lips. Like contracts used to have like basically words that would be like, there's no kissing to be had. There's none of this that can be shown. This actress cannot be shown in this way.
What I find like that just made me think of something, right? When you see actresses, Michelle Yeoh, for example, when you go to a red carpet event, quite often you wear fashion pieces that in any other context is revealing, but in that context is not. It's called fashion, right? And what I find is even TV stars in Hong Kong, they would go to events and they could be wearing, like a V-collared dress, and the headline will be, oh, Neha wears daring V-shaped, showing cleavage, and it's like, and like I get that. Let's say as a society, the conservative standards are, very different. Then how come it's okay if an actress does it, but your neighbor does it, and it's not okay? Yeah. Right, I find that really interesting that they have their own standards. And actually in Cantonese, your cleavage is called your occupation line. So the longer it is, the more successful you are. Serious? Yeah. And they will even say 3 inches of it was shown, 4 inches of it was shown.
Who can measure? Okay, now you can measure on your phone, but like seriously, who was measuring that?
That's what I mean. Like, I find this polarity so interesting, is that everything in society is trying to maintain this conservative, modest value, but you talk about it so much. It's such a big deal.
It's so
Then
funny.
just
So
don't
like
talk about it.
last year there was an actress who got married, like she was in a long-term relationship with a fellow actor, and they were living together, and then she had a baby, and quite obviously that baby was conceived before they got married. Right?
Yeah.
Anyone could do the maths. And it was interesting, like the discourse on it, like people were like, well, duh, obviously, like everyone else had figured it out, and everyone was like, but then also because she was so beloved as an actress, they were like, well, we can't scandalize this because this is just fact. Like there is no way to spin that, right? At that point. And so then it was like, okay, well, that's okay. That's okay for her.
Because they're married now anyway.
Yes. But I do think like there has been a shift. I've certainly noticed amongst like British Indian like women in particular, and I'll talk about it from like a female perspective because that's our gaze, but I think there's much more sexual liberation that is written about, spoken about, blogged about, podcasts. And one of my favorite podcasts is Brown Girls Do It Too. And I think it's just so wildly entertaining. It's literally exactly what it sounds like. There's an influencer who wrote a book, What Would the Aunties Say? And I know auntie culture is big as well in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And it's, again, it touches on all of these things that most people our age are just not like bothered by, but somehow still feel the need to maintain the appearance of when we talk to an older generation.
I dress much more conservatively in Hong Kong. And for people who don't know me and are listening to this, just to clarify, I don't dress promiscuously.
Not at all.
But you know how I dress.
Yeah.
I think doubly conservative when I'm there. I don't wear shorts when I'm in Hong Kong.
And I would agree that sometimes when I travel to other places, for the sake of the ease of convenience and not attracting the attention, I do blend in. And I likewise, I hardly would say I dress anything less than conservatively, even in the UK, but there are places where I won't wear, denim cut-offs. Whereas in London, I'll quite happily run around when, the 2 days of the year we get 30-degree weather. But maybe I wouldn't do it as openly in other places. So I think some of it is what we do privately versus how we portray ourselves publicly is a battle that I think hasn't gone away. And it's common. Like everything I think I'm saying and everything you've said, I think we've had very similar experiences there.
So kind of at a tangent, but kind of related. Let's talk about LGBTQ, right? Because I think we're both from very conservative cultures, actually. And quite often at work with DEI conversations, I remind people, it's well and good for you to talk about this so openly and kind of fight for your rights, whatever here. We're from cultures where people may not even be comfortable talking about it. So I heard recently, or quite recently, the Supreme Court in India, I think, has finally, is it decriminalizing homosexuality?
Yeah, so that didn't happen until 2018. That's less than 5 years ago, right? I think also, let's put it into context. I think you probably said the same thing in Hong Kong, was homosexuality was still criminal in the UK until the 1960s, until we repealed those laws. So I know we like to think that we're miles ahead of everyone else, but let's just kind of think the long view of history. Just because something is also decriminalized, it doesn't mean that homophobia is suddenly gone away. It's very prevalent. And I would say those values still ring true in the Indian diaspora. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. British Indians, I think if you were to survey people, their attitudes to homosexuality are conservative, but also not necessarily informed. I would be as bold to say that, because it isn't something that is talked about.
Has it got anything to do with religion at all? Like, is it in Hinduism at all?
It's interesting you say that, right? Because a lot of very eminent, Hindu scholars, Hindu priests have spoken. It's that there is nothing in Hinduism that bans homosexuality or bans it terrible. There is, then other people point to scripture, because Hinduism is such a broad church, again, excuse the pun, of a religion. There are other people who point to scripture that say it's unnatural, it's not, considered the norm. But that same scripture in history tells us that it has been around for millennia in Indian culture. It's not a new phenomena.
Aren't some of the gods kind of, they're not, what's the word for it? Let me wait, moving to this bit. Aren't some of the gods, like, how do I put it? Like, they're both genders, or like they're genderless?
They're pansexual, like, not pansexual, they're
yeah.
Well, as in their gender has no form.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's the point, is to say that this is not, like, people say, oh, people today, oh, like the youth today, they're morally corrupt, or this problem of homosexuality is something that has come to the fore, either at the post-AIDS movement or whatever. No, like, it has been around from ancient texts, but I think people have used religion to shape customs and traditions, and that's invariably the position, right? Because the socio norm is man plus woman in marriage.
When was the first time you came across anyone who wasn't heterosexual?
So yeah, I mean, like I said, I grew up here in the UK. I went to a girls' school, so I'm pretty sure you'd say the same thing. Is there was lesbianism, it was present, it was talked about, it was known, and there were some people who did feel comfortable in their sexuality and comfortable enough to express it. I'd say my learning of, or my awareness of LGBTQ, and then it wasn't plus, it was just LGBTQ, was very academic, if that's the right word, in school. Like, I knew what those things were, I knew a little bit about the movements, but really my exposure would be at university. I came across formal people from different walks of life, and that's when I started to even have friends that I knew were either openly gay, bi, etc. So yeah. What about you?
School as well. I feel like I actually didn't have that more academic education of this. It's just that there's always some representation in TV shows, and you'll be surprised, back in the 90s probably in Hong Kong, there were Hong Kong produced films that were about gay romances and things like that, with the then most popular actors. So I think for me it was never a sudden shock to the system. And of course, don't forget Elton John, Ricky Martin, it's just there, right?
But was it, I've got a question for you though, was it okay, or like, was it like you could love Elton's music or you could love Ricky Martin's music, but that didn't necessarily mean that you wanted to be that person? So for example, lots of people love George Michael, but if you ask them, do you want your child to be George Michael and live George Michael's life, they'd be like, absolutely not. Like, it's that sense of, you can love the art and the artist. Yeah,
it was that. So it was not in my backyard, basically. It was that kind of attitude. Yeah,
I would still say, I'm sure they might be saying, I still think that embodies the view of most people of my parents' generation. It's fine and it's okay, and we're not going to be livid about the fact that two men want to live together or two women want to live together, but we prefer it not to be our children.
Yeah. And I think for me, back to the question of my first encounter, I guess, definitely secondary school. I think primary school, again, sexual maturity came late in Hong Kong, relative to here, so nobody was really thinking about it. But even in primary school, if I really think about it, I had quite a few classmates who were distinctively more boyish, down to how they got their hair cut, And somehow, we were wearing the same uniform, but they were just more masculine. In Hong Kong, they're TBs, tomboys.
Yeah.
And then there are more feminine presenting ones. And I guess because I was always with these people, they were just my classmates. It never gave me a reason not to be friends with someone. It would be because they were just annoying or horrible. It wouldn't be because of their sexual orientation. But when you were talking about all of that as an adult now, I had this suddenly quite sad realization that none of them were openly lesbian or bisexual.
Okay.
Right? Somehow within the walls of a very religious school, that was safe enough for them to have, teen relationships while, during school hours. But I'm 100% sure none of their parents knew.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. It's people cover in many ways, right?
But masking is what girls are great at.
So yeah, it's that is very interesting. When you came to the UK, did you find it was any more open?
Well, so in my school, I'm not going to out anyone, but one of my really good friends at school, she was a TB. She almost got kicked out of school because the matron found her in a different girl's room.
Right. Okay.
So meaning, yes, it was more open, I guess, in a way, in terms of expression, but it wasn't more accepted.
No.
Probably because we were in a very religious school.
Yeah.
I think at university, definitely more open. So I went to Exeter, which is arguably one of the party universities, I think. So anything went, I think, and people just enjoy being friends with people. But I do find that these things are more easily discussed in this country, for sure. There's no stigma, well, at least with people I talk to. There's a lot less kind of, lowering of the voice when you mention that term. There's a lot less of that. You know what I mean? You know exactly what I mean.
I do, and it's really funny because I'm sort of laughing, but do you know, in a lot of languages, or even Indian languages, I'll talk about the language we speak home, people will just stop short of saying it. They'll be like, oh, or they're like that, or that kind, or that's exactly what they say. And I remember, I don't know if you've ever made any of her recipes, but Nadia, who won Bake Off, she's Bengali, and she said in her language there was no word for somebody becoming pregnant. People just have a baby. They acknowledge that they have sex to have the baby, but there's no word for it. And so she goes, now with my children, I delight in them going up to older people and saying she's pregnant when somebody's pregnant, just to see the level of discomfort. And I just thought it was the funniest thing I'd heard.
That's so interesting. I'm trying to think of what word we don't have a word for.
Is there a word for being a lesbian or being a gay person, a trans person?
Interestingly, the word for being a lesbian and a gay person is the same.
Yeah.
It's both homosexual, so it covers,
it's gender neutral.
Everything. And in fact, that could be its own other episode. I am finding that the Chinese language is a lot more gender inclusive because it's just very gender neutral.
I realized that when I did my very, very quick and admittedly short crash course in Mandarin, but I found words were not as gendered.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't find that in,
right.
Yeah, other languages.
So I guess the last thing with coming of age, because we can talk for hours on this topic, the last couple of things I guess that we can link together is around independence, right? So this is both in terms of money. I think money is a big thing, as well as decision making, personal independence. So what was it like for you? I mean, I know what it was like for you. It sounded much more progressive than my culture.
So I'd say like my awareness of money started very young. Like my mom would always take me to the shop, like I'd count change, buying fruit in bed, all that kind of stuff. And my school had a bank. And by that, all I mean is, so every Friday was bank, it'd be like, I'm going to the bank. And what it was a very well-known high street bank at the time came in and basically set up a branch in the school on Fridays.
So they bought cool.
And the upper years got to be trained to be cashiers and have the ledger. And everybody used to bank a £1 coin, right?
Yeah.
And you'd record it at the time we used to have like bank, like the books, which I know sounds like it's going to date me so badly, but everybody they'd write the date and like what you paid in and the new balance and all of that. And so my kind of, learning to balance checkbook, so to use an American term, that started very young for me. And I think my parents, I guess, were they taught me about financial, they gave me my financial literacy, which I think is quite common, but I do know that was very open. I don't know that everybody else necessarily had the same kind of conversations about money. And they let me, once I like moved out and I left home, I started to manage my own money at university. Whilst I was at home, they managed my money while I was at school. That was how it was.
Okay.
I did not get paid for doing chores or jobs. Like this concept of like, I will pay you to make your bed. Like, no, absolutely not. Like that.
It wasn't a bargain.
No, but equally, like I never felt like I would just ask. If I wanted something, you just asked. Yeah. But I think there is an element of control in that. And I think, but while you're a child, there is some aspect of, I can understand why. But if you wanted, you just asked.
So for me, it was very different. It didn't come from school. It came from red packets from Lunar New Year. So one of the first, like, earliest memories of money must have been, on day 5 or 6 of the Lunar New Year, sitting in bed with my brother and like gleefully just ripping all of the red packets open and counting up the money. So like that's probably how I learned to count money, to be honest. Like, grouping them into the different denominations and like totaling it up. And then one thing like my dad always used to do with us, so back in the day, before things were digital, and you went to these tatanteng, which are like these tea houses in Hong Kong, you would the waiter would come with like a simple kind of memo pad.
Yeah.
Scribble whatever scribble it is that meant the dishes we wanted to order. And then at the end, he would bring up the bill, which is handwritten.
Yes.
And my dad would always, take it and then count us down to how quickly we can total it up. I think that's probably why I'm good at maths, at like mental maths. So I think money, as many people may have guessed, is part and parcel of living in Hong Kong. I think everyone is hyper aware of money, be it from the angle of its scarcity, how expensive things are, or as a consumer buying branded goods. I actually, that's how important money is. I think I don't remember it kind of formally being introduced to me as a new concept. It's just there every day. We also got given pocket money to buy snacks at school. I think it was a weekly allowance. But similar to your case, I think, like if it was big ticket items, like I want a new pair of trainers or things like that, we just ask our parents. But you said that aged you. I have memories of taking my little deposit book to the HSBC branch in Hong Kong to like put it in a machine, get it stamped, and taking it back out. Yeah, I remember that.
Obviously, I then got trained to be a cashier at school bank. Obviously, that was like the highlight of primary school. I will say, like, I think Asians in general have a very interesting relationship with intergenerational wealth.
Yeah.
And I think I think you agree on this point of the way we view intergenerational wealth and the expectations of intergenerational wealth, I think are quite different to what I encounter in British society. So it is very, very common that parents will support children, and that can range from, as you know, small things of like education to like supporting through uni, through, you know, if you need somewhere to crash, you know, etc., through to like, here, let me buy you a home, let me buy you a car, let me give you cash to like kickstart your life, whatever. Like, but that's not uncommon. And if you talk to any of our Asian friends, and even to each other, like, it's really not like unheard of. It's just the scale that varies, I think.
Yeah. I don't think this is actually unique to my family or your family. It's an unspoken agreement that in exchange for this basically unconditional financial support, there is also unconditional obedience.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. That's all I'm saying.
Exactly. And look, I think it's a price that many people are willing to pay. Excuse the pun. But I think this is just to be expected. And here, I remember another culture shock, right? When I went to uni, apart from student loans, right?
Yeah.
People basically had no money unless their parents lent them money. And that showed me a very, I guess, drastically different perspective. You know, I remember actually spending a lot less than I could because I didn't want to get ostracized for having money. Yes. And I'm not filthy rich, right? I'm just saying, you know, in Hong Kong, we're just middle class. But because of financial support from my parents, it was never an issue for me.
You know what's interesting, though? I think that continues well into adulthood, and we'll touch on it in another episode, I'm sure. But I know at work, for example, that perpetuates.
My God. Yeah, let's talk about it in that episode. Just on a lighter note, I wanted to finish on a lighter note. I wanted to hear how your personal independence was in terms of going around, like getting around, going about school activities.
So in primary school, once I hit an age where I was kind of road aware and, you know, understood road safety, I used to walk to school. So that was my own little, you know, bit of independence. I used to walk back. The only time I wasn't allowed to, because there was a canal that I used to have to cross, was after netball practice if it got really dark. Like, I wasn't allowed to go that way. I had to follow the main road, which is a safety thing. And then from the age of 11, I used to commute to school. So it was a 13-mile trip each way. So I used to take 2 trains and a bus.
On your own?
Some other girls, but yeah, like without my parents. So I had a lot of personal independence. So, you know, I was very mobile for somebody on a you know, public transport network, which is, looking back at it, quite brave. I mean, particularly given we didn't live in London, so it's not like today you see a lot of children jumping on the tube quite young because they're going to school and like their parents have to go to work, so then they've got to go in a different direction. It wasn't that. It was I was on my own. And that, I think, carried right on. Like, I was very comfortable traveling internationally on my own. Like, you know, I always like flew a lot on my own, even like quite young. Like, that doesn't bother me and it doesn't worry me. But yeah, I was always able. And once I started to drive, I know the very short period in time where I like to actually drive, yeah, I'd be able to go. I don't ever remain feeling like constrained, if that's the question.
No. I mean, it's just wild to me that at that age you were taking public transport on your own. And again, caveat socioeconomic status, because I know there must have been girls at my school who were doing the same thing at that age. But with my friends and myself, I took the school bus until, I would say, year 8, maybe, when like the extracurricular activities were much more frequent than made sense for me to be paying for the school bus and not being on it. But even then, my nanny would take me down and see me off onto the school bus, and she would be there when I arrived from the school bus. So it was very point to point. Someone was always there. When I started taking public transport, so I traveled far, like in Hong Kong terms, because I lived on Hong Kong Island, but my school was in Kowloon. So I had to take the MTR across the Victoria Harbour. I first had to take a bus and then take the tube and then walk. So when I first started doing this, I must have been like 13, 14. My nanny would still be there to pick me up. She would just take the journey with me. She would still be there. And partly, you know, protective Asian parents, and partly there was a wave of child kidnappings in Hong Kong when I was growing up. So that didn't really help. But I think the overall kind of parent-child hierarchy in our cultures meant that you don't really get a lot of personal independence, but you also didn't miss it because it just
you didn't know you didn't have it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the initial kind of, you know, toes in the water moments of making a choice for me were saying to my parents, I don't like Chinese painting. I don't want to go anymore. And I must have been like 5, you know, and I was surprised actually that I kind of said it, like thinking back in terms of how traditional my family was.
Yeah.
And they allowed me to stop going. Like I just went and did something else instead. And it definitely built up, right? A typical child growing up in Hong Kong, I think, would be about things that are how you wanted to tie your hair, you know, to like what extracurricular activities. And then when you got to, you know, last episode we talked about GCSEs, right? Picking science stream or art stream. So it kind of escalated very, very slowly until probably university, when suddenly you had to make decisions like you need to pay rent, you need to find a property to rent with your friends, etc. Yeah, so I think it's growing up, coming of age in Hong Kong is definitely a slower process, I would say.
I think the world and like society here forces it to happen quicker. I am sure that given the choice, not everybody would do what I just explained, right? And put their child on public transport at 11. And to be clear, a lot of people don't, right? That did not happen to my brother. He got driven to school every single day. But, and I have just pulled him out for it, but it's again down to preference and also what's acceptable, right? My parents found that was acceptable to their risk tolerance. And their preference was to send me to that school, and that was the option. And that was baked into it.
What part of the country was this?
In the Midlands, so in the West Midlands. So
see, I would find that more palatable than if my child was in London, actually. I think London is much more dangerous than like a quiet Midlands town.
And that probably is part of it. I would agree. But you also think, would I want my child where there's people on, you know, brightly lit corridors and tube stations where there's, you know, thousands of people and your CCTV within an inch of its life, or down country lanes? And it's neither's better nor worse, but yeah, there are definite cultural differences even within location within a country. So yeah, I think that just about covers growing up, getting out of the home, making it to uni. I think next time when we return, we'll be talking about the working world and what our professional journeys have looked like.
So thank you for listening this week, and tune in for the next episode.
Subscribe, rate and review on your favourite podcast platform, and follow us on Instagram at Culturally Speaking Podcast. You can also check out our website culturallyspeaking.co.uk for a transcript of this episode. Share your stories or your show ideas with us by sending us an email at theculturallyspeaking@gmail.com.